He grabbed her arm in the middle of the shopping center, in front of everyone, and nobody moved. Not one person. Zora Bellamy felt his fingers dig into her coat sleeve, the same fingers that had left bruises on her wrists 3 years ago, and she thought, this is how it always starts. Quietly. Then it isn't quiet anymore. Brett Halden leaned in close enough that she could smell the same cologne he always wore, and he said the thing he knew would cut the deepest. Not an insult about her intelligence. Not a threat. Something worse, the kind of words a man uses when he wants a woman to feel like she was never real to begin with. The shoppers watched with their phones half raised. And then the crowd went completely silent. Not because of Zora. Because of the man who had just walked back through the doors. If you've ever been told you were too much, too loud, too big, too dark, too something, and someone still chose to stand beside you anyway, this story is going to hit different. Stay with me until the end. And if this is the kind of story that makes you feel seen, please subscribe to this channel and hit that like button. I pour everything into these, and every notification matters. Drop a comment and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to know how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that Tuesday afternoon in Chicago. The cold came off Lake Michigan like it had a personal grudge. That particular kind of Chicago winter wind that doesn't just make you cold, it makes you feel like the city itself is deciding whether you belong there. Zora Bellamy walked through the Meridian shops on Michigan Avenue with her shoulders pulled back and her jaw set in, the way that people who'd met her twice described as confident, and people who'd known her for years recognized as armor. She was 32 years old, she was tall, she was heavy, in the way that certain people spent their entire lives trying to describe politely while meaning something unkind. Her skin was a deep, rich brown, the kind of color that photographs beautifully and that strangers somehow felt entitled to comment on. Her natural hair was pulled up today, loosely, not because she was trying to be presentable for anyone, but because she'd been running late and hadn't decided yet whether she cared enough to fix it properly. She didn't fix it. That was something new, the not caring. Or maybe the more accurate word was the not performing. For most of her adult life, Zora had dressed like a woman preparing to defend herself. Clothes that minimized, colors that faded into backgrounds, necklines that apologized. She'd learned early, the way black girls in certain zip codes learn certain things early, that her body was going to be commented on, regardless of what she did. So she'd spent years trying to give people less to comment on. It hadn't worked. People found things anyway. The coat she was wearing today was different. Roman had bought it for her 6 weeks ago, deep charcoal gray wool, long-fitted, built for a woman who took up space without apology. The first time she'd put it on, she'd stood in front of the mirror in his penthouse for almost 4 minutes before she realized she was waiting for someone to tell her she shouldn't wear it. When she realized no one was coming to say that, she'd put it on and walked out of the bedroom, and Roman had looked up from his laptop and said nothing for a moment and then said, "That's yours, in that flat." Certain say he had of stating things that weren't quite compliments, but landed heavier. She still thought about those 2 words sometimes. That's yours. She was thinking about them now as she navigated the shopping center, not because she needed anything particular, but because Roman had a call he needed to take in private, and they'd agreed to meet back at the coffee counter in 40 minutes. 40 minutes to exist without an agenda, without the low-level vigilance that came with being near Roman Caldrisi in public spaces. She'd been looking forward to it. In a way, she felt slightly embarrassed to admit 40 minutes of just being a woman in a mall, anonymous, ordinary, unremarkable. Chicago had other ideas. She was 3 stores away from the coffee counter, close enough to smell the espresso, when she heard his voice. It wasn't loud. That was the thing about Brett. His cruelty had never needed volume. He'd always operated in the register just below a scene, just quiet enough that anyone watching might convince themselves they'd misheard something. His particular genius, if you could call it that, and Zora had decided she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of calling anything about him. A genius was that he understood exactly how much deniability a whisper provided. "Well," he said, from somewhere to her left, "look at that." Zora didn't stop walking. That was important. She told herself afterward that she'd made a conscious choice not to stop, but the truth was more complicated. The truth was that some part of her body had already recognized his voice before her mind caught up, and that part of her was 17 different kinds of afraid, and fear made her feet keep moving forward as if she could outpace the moment. That coat must have cost somebody a lot of money, Brett said louder now, because she hadn't stopped. Because she hadn't given him the reaction he was shopping for. Shame it doesn't fit better. She stopped, not because of what he said. Because of what she felt the second he said it, something hot and specific climbing, from her sternum to her throat, and she recognized it from years of practice, the feeling that preceded saying something she couldn't take back. The feeling that preceded a scene. She stopped, because she needed the half-second to decide whether this was the day she made a scene. She decided it wasn't. She turned around. Brett Halden was 38 now, and still good-looking, in the way that men who've spent 30 years being told they're good-looking sometimes are slightly worn at the edges, soft in places he'd never been soft before, but fundamentally still selling the same product. A man who believed he was the most interesting person in any room. He was wearing a suit that cost less than the shoes Roman wore to the grocery store, and Zora cataloged that tale immediately, and then felt a small wave of shame for cataloging it, because she didn't want to be someone who measured people by their clothing. Then she remembered what he'd just said, and the shame evaporated. Brett, just his name, flat, no question in it. He grinned. You look, he made a small gesture with his hand, the kind of vague wave that finished sentences about women's bodies that the speaker wanted to be able to deny later. Different, he settled on. Expensive, almost. What happened? You win the lottery. I'm going to keep walking now, Zora said. You seeing somebody? He fell into step beside her casual, as if they were old friends catching up. That was the other thing about Brett, the ease. The way his entitlement expressed itself not as aggression, but as assumption. He assumed he was welcome everywhere. He assumed his presence was desired. He had never, in the 14 years Zora had known him, internalized the concept that he could be unwanted somewhere. What kind of man buys a coat like that? For he looked at her. Let the pause do the work. Well, for you specifically. Zora walked. The coffee counter was 30 feet away. 28. I'm just asking, Brett said. Because whoever he is, he's either blind or he's got a very specific taste that, I'll be honest with you, Zora, I never would have predicted there was a market for. 25 feet. 22. I always thought you'd figure it out eventually, he continued, and his voice had dropped now, shifted into the register she remembered from their marriage, that intimate, almost gentle tone he used when he was about to say something genuinely devastating. That the reason I had trouble was you, not because of anything wrong with me. Just because some women are, he shook his head. Sympathetic. Performing sympathy, the way he performed everything. Some women need someone to convince them there's a market for them, you know? Someone patient enough to do that work. Zora stopped, 20 feet from the coffee counter. She stopped and she turned and she looked at him. And what she felt in that moment was not anger or not only anger. It was something older and more complicated. It was the feeling of standing in the kitchen of the apartment on Wabash Avenue at 11 at night, listening to him explain with tremendous reasonableness why her response to being ignored was the actual problem. It was the feeling of believing him, of writing it down somewhere inside herself and filing it next to the other things she'd believed that had turned out to be constructed entirely to keep her manageable. You should go, she said. Zora, I mean it, Brett. He looked at her for a moment. Then the grin came back, smaller now, sharper. The one that meant she'd said something that inconvenienced him. You know what the funny thing is? You walk around in this coat like you belong here, and I'm looking at you and thinking, who told her that? Who convinced her she belongs in a place like this? Because it wasn't anybody in her family. It wasn't anybody who grew up where you grew up. Somebody recent convinced you of something, and I just wonder. He tilted his head. How long before they see what I saw? She walked away. Not because she didn't have an answer. She had approximately 11 answers, each one more precisely aimed than the last. She walked away because she'd learned slowly, expensively, Across 3 years of rebuilding something that resembled her self-respect, that winning arguments with Brett Halden was not actually winning anything. He didn't change. He absorbed the argument and filed it and used it later. Every direct confrontation gave him information. Every reaction confirmed for him that she was still paying attention, still responding, still in some measurable way available to him. She walked away because not responding was the thing he couldn't file. She was almost at the counter when his hand closed around her arm. Not gently. The grip was sudden and hard, the kind that communicated something without words. I decide when this conversation is over. She felt the fingers through the wool of the coat, felt the specific pressure that her nervous system had cataloged 3 years ago and never forgotten. And she had one full second of pure animal fear before she got her breathing under control and became very, very still. "I'm not finished talking to you," Brett said. Low. Close. The people near the counter had stopped moving. Not many 6'8" people, but enough that Zora registered the shift in the air. The collective decision a group of strangers makes in the first second of witnessing something uncomfortable, is this bad enough to require action, or can we classify it as something else? They classified it as something else. She could feel them doing it. "Let go of my arm," Zora said, "when I'm done." Brett, her voice was steady. She was proud of how steady it was. She was also aware that pride in the steadiness of one's voice, while a man's hand is locked around one's arm, in a public place was a symptom of something, though she'd have to think about what exactly when she wasn't currently occupied. "You are going to let go of my arm," he laughed. Quiet. Private. A laugh that said, "And if I don't?" A laugh that remembered 14 years of her not being able to answer that question. Then he leaned close, and he said the thing he'd been working toward from the beginning of this conversation. The thing he'd come here to say. Maybe he'd planned it. Maybe it was instinct. With Brett, the line between strategy and reflex had always been thin. He leaned in close enough that she could feel his breath, and he said, very quietly, against the side of her face, "Nobody is ever going to actually want you. You know that, right? Whatever you've got going on right now, whoever bought you that coat, he's performing something. He's not choosing you. Men don't choose women who look like you. They use them sometimes, for a reason, and then they're done. And you'll come back to real life, and you'll know I was right, and there won't be anybody to blame but the woman who looked in the mirror and convinced herself she saw something worth choosing." The coffee counter was 15 feet away. The phones were up. Nobody had moved. Zora was looking at the middle distance, at a fixed point somewhere past Brett's shoulder, breathing in a slow and deliberate way that she'd learned from a therapist she'd seen for 14 months after the divorce. You can feel the feeling without becoming the feeling. She was feeling a great many feelings. She was not becoming them. She was also in some small still part of her brain that ran separately from everything else, aware that the shopping center had gotten quieter than it should be for a Tuesday afternoon. Not all the way quiet, just quieter. Brett must have noticed too, because he straightened slightly. His hand didn't leave her arm, but his attention shifted. And Zora, who had spent a significant portion of her adult life learning to read Brett's attention the way a weather forecaster reads pressure systems, felt the change before she understood it. Something in the set of his jaw, a new alertness behind his eyes. She looked toward the entrance. Roman Caldrisi was walking back through the glass doors. He wasn't moving quickly. He didn't need to move quickly. He was a tall man with a kind of build that suggested he had never, at any point in his life, needed to rush toward anything in order to make his point, and he moved with the particular ease of a person who understood that rooms reorganize themselves before he arrives. He was still holding his phone, call apparently finished, and he was looking at Zora with an expression that she had learned to read over the past 8 months, and that most people who encountered it never had the opportunity to read twice. It wasn't anger. It was assessment. It was the expression of a man doing math. He slipped his phone into his inside jacket pocket, and he walked toward them. And the small group of bystanders parted, in the way that people part for someone they instinctively understand to be categorically different from themselves. And he stopped 3 feet away and looked at Brett's hand on Zora's arm. with the specific stillness of a man who has decided something and is now simply implementing it. "Release her arm," Roman said. His voice was even, conversational, the same tone he used to discuss real estate contracts. Brett's grip tightened for exactly 1 second, the last reflex of a man whose ego couldn't immediately process the instruction, and then he let go. "She's fine," Brett said. "We're just talking. Old friends." "She asked you to let go," Roman said, "more than once from what I heard." And something shifted in Brett's face, a recalibration. He was looking at Roman the way men sometimes looked at Roman before they knew who Roman was, sizing him up, deciding whether the confidence was backed by anything real or whether it was just clothes and posture. Brett was still doing that math. His eyes were still running the calculation. The calculation changed when the two men appeared at Roman's shoulders. They'd materialized from somewhere near the entrance. Big men, quiet men, men whose suits fit in a way that only partially the suits were concealing, and they positioned themselves with the practiced stillness of people who did this professionally. Not threatening, not explicitly, just present in a way that made the space around Roman feel like it had very clearly defined edges. The blood left Brett's face so quickly that Zora, despite everything, almost felt something. Not sympathy, she was clear-eyed enough about herself to know it wasn't sympathy. More like recognition. The recognition of watching someone realize in real time that they had fundamentally misread a situation. "Roman Caldrisi," Brett said. Not a question. A statement with a rising inflection that tried to hide how much it was actually a question. Roman didn't answer that. He stepped forward not toward Brett, but toward Zora, and he's just inside the distance where a person had to make a decision about personal space, and he looked at her face with an attention that didn't perform itself, didn't announce itself, just happened. "You okay?" he said. 2 words. "Same register as you want coffee?" "Same register as I'll be 5 minutes." The total absence of drama in the question was somehow the most dramatic thing that had happened in the last 10 minutes. Zora felt something in her chest release that she hadn't known she was holding. "I'm okay," she said. Roman nodded once. Then he turned back to Brett with the full, undivided weight of his attention, and Zora watched Brett physically adjust to receiving it, watched him straighten, watched him attempt to reassemble the confidence that had been doing so well for him 30 seconds ago. "I think we're done here," Roman said. "You're going to walk out. You're not going to come back in." "She's my ex-wife," Brett said. The word ex-wife, doing considerable work, establishing claim, establishing context, establishing that he had prior rights to this conversation that Roman was interrupting. "I know who you are," Roman said. The 4 words arrived with a weight that made Brett's entire claim structure collapse, like a building someone had quietly removed the foundation from. "I know who you are from Roman Caldrisi." In that particular tone, meant several things at once, and none of the things it meant were comfortable. Brett looked at Zora. One more time. The look said, and she'd heard it in his voice many times before, translated many different ways, "This isn't over." She held his gaze without blinking, and then he left. She didn't remember deciding to follow Roman. She'd found herself moving, when he moved, back toward the entrance, and his security fell into a loose configuration around them that felt less like protection and more like privacy, like a pocket of quiet carved out of the public noise. Outside, a car was waiting, not Roman's usual one, smaller, plainer, and she got in because he held the door, and because her legs were still doing the thing legs did sometimes, after adrenaline runs through them, the slight unreliability, the sense that she was operating on a small delay. In the car, she looked at her hands. She became aware, arriving with a delay, that her arm ached where Brett's fingers had been. Roman was on the phone again almost immediately, someone from his office. Something about a property, close. Numbers she didn't track. He sat across from her in the small back seat and talked, and she looked out the window at Chicago, going past. The gray buildings, the gray sky, the people moving in coats against the cold, and she thought about what Brett had said. Not the big thing, the last thing, the whispered thing, the knife he'd sharpened specifically for her, but the smaller things. The coat. Shame it doesn't fit better. The question of who had convinced her she belonged somewhere. The implication that belonging was something that could only be granted, not claimed. She'd heard variations of it her whole life, from different mouths, with different levels of politeness. The core message, underneath every variation, was the same: you are provisional. Your presence in any room is conditional. The conditions are set by people who look different from you, and they can revoke them. Brett had just been the version that said it directly. Roman ended the call. He put the phone in his pocket and looked at her. Just looked. He had a way of doing that, no preamble, no social scaffolding, that she'd found alarming in the beginning, and had come to understand as one of the stranger forms of respect she'd been shown. He's going to be a problem, Roman said. He's always been a problem, Zora said. He was a problem when I married him, and a problem when I divorced him, and I expect he'll continue being a problem until someone removes the relevant incentives. Roman looked at her for a moment. What does that mean to you? It means what it means, she said. I don't want to know the specifics. Something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but what a smile would look like if it had decided not to complete itself. Okay, he said. She turned back to the window. Chicago was still going past. Same buildings, same gray, but she became aware, in a way she hadn't been a few minutes ago, that her shoulders had dropped. Not because she'd consciously die quietly, not because she'd consciously let them, because somewhere in the last 10 minutes, something that had been braced against a blow had realized the blow wasn't coming from this direction. The penthouse was 42 floors above Michigan Avenue and looked out at the lake, which was the color of iron in winter, and beautiful anyway, in the way that hard things sometimes were. Zora sat in the bathroom with the door open. Not closed, she'd noticed that she never fully closed the door anymore. A small deliberate reclamation of something, and waited for the bruise on her arm to show itself, which it began to do within the hour, a thumbprint in violet and gray against the inside of her elbow. She looked at it for a long time. She'd had bruises from Brett before. Different ones. He'd been careful, generally careful enough that she'd sometimes convinced herself she was being dramatic, which was the point of the carefulness. This one was almost less by comparison. This one he hadn't bothered to hide, which meant something about what he thought of her current situation, about how protected he believed her to be, about whether he thought she had anyone standing between her and the consequences of his moods. She walked to the large mirror in the bedroom. She stood in front of it. She'd been doing this standing in front of mirrors, without immediately looking away for about 4 months. It was still not comfortable. It was the kind of practice that felt fraudulent in the beginning, like trying to feel something you'd been told you were supposed to feel, but couldn't quite locate. She'd seen herself in mirrors for 32 years, and for most of those years, the image had been something to manage, contain, minimize, apologize for. Now she stood there and tried to see just a woman. A particular woman. The woman who had learned, late and at significant cost, to sleep through the night again. The woman who had started making her own coffee the way she actually liked it, instead of the way that didn't bother anyone. The woman who had walked into a shopping center on a Tuesday and held her ground for as long as she could against a man who had spent years collecting the specific coordinates of her worst fears about herself. She hadn't entirely held it. She'd heard what he said. She'd felt it land. She was feeling it still. She heard Roman's footsteps in the hall. She'd learned to recognize them, the weight of them, the pace, and he stopped in the doorway when he saw her. He didn't come in. He just leaned against the doorframe and looked at her in the way that she'd understood somewhere in the last few months was not the way men usually looked at her. It was not the look of a man trying to figure out what she was for. It was the look of a man who'd already answered that question for himself and wasn't revisiting it. He got in your head, Roman said. Not a question. He always could, she said. He knows where to go. What did he say? At the end. She thought about whether to tell him. She looked at his reflection in the mirror. That you were performing something. That men don't. She stopped. Reorganized the sentence. That nobody actually chooses a woman like me. That whatever this is, it's temporary, and eventually I'll know he was right. Silence. The refrigerator hummed from the kitchen, 3 rooms away. Do you believe him? Roman said. She looked at her own face. I believe that I've been told that version of the story, so many times that it installed itself in some part of me before I had the vocabulary to argue with it. And I believe that knowing it's installed doesn't make it go away. Roman was quiet for a moment. Then he pushed off the doorframe and walked into the room, and he stood behind her, looking at her in the mirror, and his face had none of the softness that people brought to these moments. In films, no particular gentleness, no performance of tenderness. Just the same attention he always brought. "You want me to tell you why I'm with you?" he said. "No," she said. "I want you to tell me the actual reason. Not the version that's supposed to make me feel better." He looked at her for a long moment. The kind of moment she'd learned he used not for effect, but for actual consideration. "You're the only person in my life," he said, "who tells me when I'm wrong. Not because you're performing independence. Not because you're trying to manage me. Because you actually think I'm wrong, and you say so. You know what that's worth in my world? There are men in my organization who've known me 15 years, who have never disagreed with me out loud." He paused. "And you walked into a room full of people who were afraid of me, and you sat down and argued with me about a restaurant reservation. First night. She remembered that. She'd thought he was going to have her removed. That's not about my body," she said. "No," Roman agreed. "But I didn't choose your body separately from you. You're not two things I'm negotiating between. Brett told you for years that you were two things: the body, the problem, and then whoever was underneath that he was willing to tolerate. That's not how I see it." He paused again. "You're one thing. I chose the one thing." She stood there looking at his face in the mirror. She wanted to believe it completely. She wanted to file it in the place where Brett's words lived and replace them. She understood, with the part of her that had been doing expensive therapy for 3 years, that it didn't work that way. That you couldn't override an installed belief with a better sentence, no matter how much you wanted to. But she also understood that the belief could erode, gradually, unevenly, in small moments of evidence that accumulated over time and eventually shifted the weight. This was one of those moments. She didn't thank him. He wouldn't have known what to do with that. She just nodded at her own reflection once. The smallest possible acknowledgement. And then she turned away from the mirror and went to get dressed for dinner, and Roman stepped out of the doorway to let her pass, and neither of them said anything else about it. That night, across town, someone Zora would never meet filed a report with a private investigative firm that Roman Caldrisi was known to retain for matters that didn't reach official channels. The report was brief. Brett Halden had, in the 3 years since the divorce, not learned anything. He had, however, located the building where Zora had been staying. He knew her schedule. He had visited the shopping center on Michigan Avenue, not by accident. Roman read the report at 1 in the morning at his desk with a glass of water he hadn't touched and his phone face down, and the particular stillness he brought to information he was processing before deciding what to do with it. He made 2 calls. He didn't tell Zora about them. She was asleep in the next room with the door open, the way she always slept now, and slept in the quiet. And Roman sat at his desk in the quiet and looked at the city lights through the window and thought about the mathematics of consequence. He had spent most of his adult life in a world where problems had solutions that were practical and final and carried their own particular costs. He knew what the cost was here. He also knew it wasn't a decision he had made yet. He put the report in the drawer and locked it, and he sat back, and Chicago burned cold and bright outside the window, and the night moved forward, the way nights in winter moved heavily, without ceremony, the hours consuming themselves one after another until morning arrived whether anyone wanted it or not. Zora would wake up, and they would have breakfast. And she would look at the bruise on her arm and say nothing about it, and Roman would say nothing about it. And somewhere between the coffee in the window and the muted sounds of the city waking up, she would begin constructing the ordinary day around the extraordinary thing that had happened yesterday. She was good at that. She'd had a lot of practice. The morning after came in sideways. Not with noise. Roman's penthouse didn't do noise, but with a quality of light through the floor-to-ceiling windows that felt accusatory, the kind of January gray that made everything look like evidence of something. Zora was up before 6, which wasn't unusual anymore. She'd stopped sleeping past dawn sometime in the second year after the divorce, her body having apparently decided that unconsciousness past a certain hour was a luxury she hadn't re-earned yet. She made coffee the way she actually liked it, 2 sugars. Enough cream to make Roman's kitchen staff visibly restrain themselves from commenting, and stood at the window in her robe and looked at the lake. The ice hadn't fully formed yet, just the edges, the shallow parts, where the water had given up and gone still. The open water in the middle was dark and restless, and moved like something that hadn't decided what it was going to do yet. She pressed 2 fingers against the bruise on her inner arm. Still there. Deeper color, now. Overnight the purple had committed to itself, spread into the surrounding skin, settled in for what she estimated would be a 10-day visit. She'd had bruises before that she'd hidden under long sleeves, under stories about door frames and gym equipment, under the specific silence that women in certain situations develop like a second language. She wasn't hiding this one. She just wasn't announcing it either. She heard Roman's alarm at 6:15, the brief sound of it before he killed it, and then the particular sequence of sounds she'd learned to map to his mornings, the shower, the quiet movement in the closet, the low voice on the phone that started before he was fully dressed. Business didn't wait for Roman Caldrisi to be ready for it. Business assumed Roman was already ready. He came into the kitchen at 6:40 in a charcoal suit and looked at the coffee situation and said nothing about the cream. He poured his own black, because of course, and stood at the counter reading something on his phone, and Zora sat on the couch with her mug and watched him and thought about what she'd been not thinking about since 3 in the morning. "You made calls last night," she said. He didn't look up from his phone. "I make a lot of calls. After 1 in the morning. From your desk. I heard you through the door." Now he looked up. The expression on his face was the one she privately thought of as the board meeting face, not a wall, exactly. More like a door that had been mostly closed and was deciding how far to open. "Building management issue," he said. "Pipe situation in the Wicker Park property. At 1 in the morning. Pipes don't keep business hours." Zora looked at him. He looked at her. The coffee maker finished its cycle with a small hiss that sounded inappropriately casual for the moment. "Roman," she said, "Zora, I'm not asking you what you did. I'm telling you that I know you did something, and I'm telling you I'm not going to pretend I don't know that. Because I spent 7 years of my life pretending not to know things in order to keep a man comfortable, and I'm done with that as a practice." He set his phone face down on the counter. That was Roman's version of full attention, the deliberate removal of all other competing inputs. She'd learned to recognize it as significant. "I made some inquiries," he said, "about how he found you, and he's been watching the building for 3 weeks. The words landed flat and stayed there, like something dropped on a table that nobody wanted to pick up. Zora absorbed them without moving. 3 weeks. She ran backward through the last 3 weeks, the dry cleaning she'd picked up alone. The Tuesday morning she'd walked to the coffee shop 6 blocks over because she'd wanted 40 minutes outside without a security configuration. The afternoon she'd met her friend Camille LaHunch at the Thai place on Oak Street, and they'd talked for 2 hours, and she'd walked home because it was only 12 blocks, and she'd wanted the air. 3 weeks of Brett Halden watching. "How?" she said. "Someone in the building's parking structure. Attendant. He paid cash, weekly, for information on vehicle movements." Roman paused. "The attendant no longer works there. That's it? That's the full extent of it?" "I'm still determining the extent of it." She looked at her coffee. The cream had settled into a particular pattern at the surface, cooling. "When you say still determining," she said carefully, "what does that mean, for Brett specifically?" "It means I'm still determining." "Roman." "Zora, I heard you before. I know what you said in the car. I'm not asking you to know specifics." "I'm asking you," she said, "to tell me if I need to prepare for something." He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive, she'd learned to tell the difference between Roman being evasive and Roman being actually careful with something. "I don't know yet," he said. "That's the true answer. I don't know yet what I'm going to do about it." He picked up his phone again. "What I know is that the breach is closed. He can't track your movements through the building anymore. But he can track them other ways. I'm working on other ways." She wanted to push further. She also understood from 8 months of navigating the specific geography of Roman Caldrisi that pushing past a certain point didn't produce more information. It produced a different kind of closed door, kind with a lock on it. She picked up her coffee and drank the rest of it, and said nothing else. He left at 7:15. She listened to the elevator descend, and then she sat in the quiet of the penthouse and thought about 3 weeks. 3 weeks of mornings she'd moved through unsupervised, believing herself to be anonymous in the city, and Brett had been out there, somewhere in a parking structure, watching vehicle logs. The image of it made something crawl across her skin. Not fear, exactly. More like violation, the specific feeling of finding out that privacy you thought you had was never real. She picked up her phone and called Camille. Camille Fuller was Zora's oldest friend, the woman who had appeared at Zora's door the night she'd finally left the Wabash Avenue apartment with one bag, and a second bag she'd packed wrong, and a face that she'd told Camille over the phone was fine. Totally fine. Can you just come? Camille had come. Camille had sat on the floor of Zora's temporary apartment for 4 hours and not said anything, and eventually said, "What do you need right now?" specifically, which was the most useful thing anyone said to Zora in that entire period. Camille picked up on the second ring. "It's 6:50, she said, no preamble. "You only call before 7 when something happened. Brett was at the mall yesterday. A beat. Divine at the mall. He grabbed me." The silence on the other end was a particular texture, not stunned, because Camille had never been stunned by anything Brett Halden did, but dangerous. The silence of a woman doing rapid internal calculations. "Where are you right now?" "Penthouse." "I'm fine. You said..." He grabbed you and then said, "You're fine," like those are compatible statements. "I have a bruise." Roman got there, Camille repeated, meaning Roman saw it. He heard it, mostly Zora. Camille's voice dropped into the register she used for things she meant. "You know what Roman Caldrisi is going to do with the fact that his girlfriend's ex-husband put hands on her in public?" "I know. Do you know what I want to do?" "I'm just saying that between Roman's version of handling it and my version, mine involves significantly less organized crime and possibly a civil lawsuit, and I want you to know that option is available." Despite everything, Zora almost smiled. "I know it is." "What do you need?" "I just needed to tell someone," Zora said. "Someone who's going to react like a human being instead of running a threat assessment." "I'm both reacting like a human being and running a threat assessment, for what it's worth." A pause. "How are you actually doing?" The question landed differently than she'd expected. She looked at the bruise on her arm. "He said the thing," she said. "You know the thing. The specific thing about the kind of woman that men don't actually choose." Camille was quiet for a moment. "Did you believe him?" "Part of me that I'm trying to evict did. Yeah. Okay. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to come over this afternoon with food from that Jamaican place you like, and you're not going to argue about it." "I wasn't going to argue. You were building toward it." I felt it. Another pause, shorter. "Don't let him live in your head rent-free, Z. He's already taken enough real estate." She hung up and sat with the phone in her hand, and the city spread out below her, and thought about real estate, and the things people occupied without permission. The detectives arrived at 9:47 in the morning. There were 2 of them. She watched them cross the lobby on the building's camera feed. Roman had shown her how to access it from her phone. One of several small practical modifications he'd made to her life that she'd accepted without fully unpacking how she felt about accepting them. The detectives were a man and a woman, the man older, gray at the temples, moving with the unhurried gait of someone who'd been doing this long enough to know that arriving slowly signaled more confidence than arriving fast. The woman younger, sharper in her coat, with the alert expression of someone still in the phase of a career where everything was information worth collecting. They identified themselves as Detectives Reyes and Marsh, Area 3 Violent Crimes. Zora asked if she needed to call someone. She said it neutrally. The way you asked a question when you already all knew the relevant answer and were trying to determine how much the other party knew. "You don't have to," Reyes said. He had a measured voice, the kind that had learned through professional repetition not to tip its hand. "We're just here to talk. Follow up on an incident reported at the Meridian shops yesterday afternoon." An incident. A physical altercation between you and a Brett Halden. We have it on 3 separate phones. Zora looked at him steadily. He grabbed me. My partner intervened. Brett left. Your partner being Roman Caldrisi, Marsh said. She had a way of inserting names into sentences, like she was testing whether the weight of them changed anything in the room. Yes, Mr. Caldrisi has a Marsh glanced at something in her notebook, though Zora had the distinct impression she wasn't actually reading anything new. Significant profile in this city, he does. Has Mr. Halden had contact with you before yesterday? In the period since your divorce. He violated a restraining order twice in the first year after the divorce. Both incidents are on record. After that, I didn't hear from him for approximately 2 years. Reyes nodded slowly. He was looking around the room in the unhurried way of someone who was looking at everything while appearing to look at nothing. Nice place, he said, with a tone that was not a compliment and not an insult, but lived precisely in the gap between. It's Roman, Zora said. I assume you know that. You've been here how long? 8 months, approximately. You and Mr. Caldrisi. We've been together for 8 months, she said. I'm not sure what that has to do with Brett grabbing me in a shopping center. Reyes looked at her, not unkindly. Miss Bellamy, Mr. Halden's whereabouts have been. He chose the next word with visible deliberation. Unclear since yesterday afternoon. The room got very still. Unclear, Zora said. He hasn't been home. He hasn't contacted his employer. His phone has been off since approximately 4 p.m. yesterday. Reyes paused. That's 16 hours. Zora looked at him. She thought about the calls Roman had made after 1 in the morning. She thought about the phrase still determining. She thought about the 2 men in suits who had materialized at Roman's shoulders in the shopping center with the practiced stillness of people who did this professionally. She thought about what she knew. She thought about what she chose to say. I went home after the incident at the mall, she said. Brett left when Roman asked him to leave. I haven't had any contact with Brett since. She paused 1 beat. I haven't had any contact with Brett in 2 years before yesterday. He initiated contact. I did not. Reyes nodded. Marsh wrote something. The scratch of pen on paper was the loudest thing in the room. Is Mr. Caldrisi available to speak with us? Marsh asked. You'd need to contact his office, Zora said. I don't schedule his meetings. Marsh looked up from her notebook. A small, recognizing look, the look of a woman clocking another woman who has decided what she is and isn't going to perform. Of course, she said. They stayed 11 more minutes. They asked whether Zora had any knowledge of Brett's associates, his habits, his routines since the divorce. She answered what she knew, which was genuinely little. She'd spent 3 years specifically not knowing anything about Brett Halden's life, a deliberate project of removal that had required significant effort. They asked whether Roman had spoken about Brett in the period before yesterday. She said, Roman knew Brett existed. Roman knew about the restraining order violations. They hadn't discussed Brett at length. All of this was technically true. She was becoming aware, in a clinical and slightly detached way, that she was very good at technically true. When they left, she sat down on the couch and put her face in her hands for approximately 30 seconds. Not crying, just inhabiting the reality of the last 18 hours, which had accumulated into a weight that required some kind of physical acknowledgement. Then she took her hands away from her face and called Roman. He picked up halfway through the first ring. The police were here, she said. I know, his voice was even. Not surprised, Reyes and Marsh. You know them. I know of them. Reyes is competent. Marsh is ambitious. Ambitious is the more dangerous of the two. Roman, she stopped. Reorganized. Brett hasn't been home. His phone is off. They're calling it unclear whereabouts. Silence on his end. The particular quality of it told her he wasn't going to confirm or deny or offer any alternative geography for Brett Halden's location. Zora, he said finally. Don't, she said. Don't explain it and don't apologize for it. And don't dress it up in something I'm supposed to accept without thinking about what I'm accepting. Okay. I need to know if I'm in something that I didn't choose to be in. He was quiet for a moment. You've been in it since the first night we had dinner, he said. I told you that. I was very clear about what I am. You were clear about your business, she said. She stopped. This is personal. Yes, Roman said. It is. The single syllable sat in the phone connection between Chicago and wherever Roman was standing, and Zora absorbed it. What do I tell them if they come back? She said. The same thing you told them this morning. And if they push harder, then you call Marcus. Marcus Thiel was Roman's attorney, a small, precise man whom Zora had met twice at dinner, and who had the energy of a person who charged by the minute and felt it. His number is in your phone, under emergency contacts. She stared at the window, the lake, the unsettled dark water moving without destination. Roman, she said, I need you to look me in the eye and tell me you know what you're doing. I can't look you in the eye through the phone. Then come home. A pause. I'll be there at noon. She put the phone down. She sat. Across the city, in the particular geography of Roman Caldrisi's empire, the offices and properties, and the men who moved quietly between them, something was already in motion. Had been in motion since the previous night. Was completing itself in increments that Zora could feel the shape of without seeing the details, the way you could feel the shape of a thing in the dark by what the air felt like around it. She knew. She'd told the detectives she'd gone home, and she'd told them Brett had left when Roman asked him to leave, and both things were true, and neither thing was the whole story. And she'd sat across from Reyes's measured competence and Marsh's sharpening ambition, and she'd delivered her technically true statements without a tremor, and then she'd waited for them to leave. That was the choice she'd made. She understood now that it was a choice, not a passive thing that had happened to her. A choice she'd made in the moment between one breath and the next, the moment when Reyes had unclear whereabouts, and she'd heard the question inside the statement and decided, with a clarity that surprised her, what she was and was not willing to say. She pressed her fingers against the bruise on her arm again. Harder this time. Brett's voice in her ear. Men don't choose women like you. 3 weeks of him in a parking structure, 2 years of that particular species of silence that isn't peace, but only preparation. She pressed her fingers into the bruise and breathed. She was still there when Camille arrived at 12:30, with food from the Jamaican place and a look on her face that said she'd heard something, or suspected something, or was operating on the Camille Fuller version of still determining. You talked to Roman, Camille said. Not a question. He came back at noon, left again at 12:15. Another meeting, another property. The city consuming him in its regular intervals. We talked. Camille set the food on the counter and looked at Zora with the specific attention of a woman who had known Zora since they were 19 years old and could read the difference between I'm fine as a social claim and I'm fine as a working hypothesis. What's happening, she said. Brett is missing, Zora said. As of yesterday afternoon. Camille was very still for a moment. Missing. That's the word the detectives used. Unclear whereabouts. Camille opened a container. Jerk chicken, the smell of it filling the kitchen, something so ordinary and domestic against the texture of the conversation that Zora felt an almost hysterical appreciation for it. Zora, Camille said carefully, do you need to tell me something? No, Zora said. I need to eat lunch with my best friend and not think for 1 hour about any of it. Camille looked at her for a long moment. Then she got 2 plates from the cabinet she knew where they were, had been to the penthouse enough times to navigate it, and she served both of them, and she sat down at the kitchen island and she said, okay, 1 hour. Tell me about the gala thing Roman mentioned. The charity thing. Are you actually going? He wants to cancel, Zora said. I told him we're not canceling. Camille looked up. Yeah? Yeah. Zora picked up a fork. I'm done letting other people decide when I'm visible. Camille looked at her for another moment. Then she nodded once, with a weight to it that wasn't about the gala at all. Okay, she said again. They ate. Outside, the Chicago afternoon went gray and grayer, and the lake moved the way it moved in winter, constantly, purposelessly, the water turning itself over and over as if it was looking for something lost and had not yet concluded was gone. And 2 miles away, in the lower level of a parking structure on South Michigan, a black SUV sat with its engine running, and a man inside it who had spent 11 hours making certain that a particular problem would not require Roman Caldrisi's direct attention again. The man's name was Vincent, and he had worked for Roman for 9 years, and he was very good at his job, which was the kind of job that didn't have a formal title. The problem, such as it was, had been resolved. What remained was the paperwork of its resolution, which in Vincent's line of work looked nothing like paperwork, and everything like the slow, patient consumption of a loose end. He pulled out of the parking structure at 12:52. He did not go back the same way he'd come. He did not contact Roman directly. He made one call to a number that wasn't in his phone's regular directory, said 4 words, and ended the call. By evening, there would be nothing left to find, and somewhere in the city, a detective named Marsh was sitting at her desk, in Area 3 looking at 17 minutes of mall surveillance footage on a loop. And she was looking specifically at the moment when Roman Caldrisi had walked through the glass doors, and the entire geography of a public space had rearranged itself around him. And she was thinking about the word whereabouts and the word unclear, and the word ambition, which was a word other people used about her, and which she'd decided, years ago, to wear without apology. She watched Roman's face on the footage. She watched Zora's. She watched the moment when Brett Halden had turned and seen Roman, and the color had drained out of him like something fundamental being removed. She pressed pause. She looked at Brett Halden's face, frozen on the screen, caught in the moment of realizing what he'd walked into. And Marsh thought he knew. He knew exactly who Roman Caldrisi was, and he put his hands on her anyway. Which meant either Brett Halden was the most reckless man in Chicago, or someone had told him something about Roman and Zora that made him believe Roman's protective reach didn't extend as far as it did. Someone had given him information, which meant Brett Halden wasn't the only problem. She reached for her coffee. It was cold. She drank it anyway. She picked up her phone and made a call she hadn't cleared with Reyes. She was going to pull Brett Halden's financials, his phone records, 18 months back. She was going to find the person who'd been feeding him information about Zora's life, because that person was still out there, and they were still connected to Roman Caldrisi's worlds, in some way. And Marsh understood instinctively, the way you understood things, after enough years in the specific work of finding what people hid, that whoever that person was, they were a thread. And threads, when you pulled them, unraveled things. She put in the request. She stared at Brett's frozen face on the screen. She pressed play again, and the moment unfroze itself, and Brett's color kept draining, and Roman kept walking, and Zora stood perfectly still in the middle of everything, with her chin raised and her eyes fixed somewhere past all of it. Already deciding, you could see it, if you watched her face already deciding what she was going to say when the time came. Marsh watched that moment 3 more times. Then she closed the laptop and put on her coat and went to find the thread. Detective Marsh found the thread on a Thursday. It took her 4 days of pulling records that technically required more authorization than she had, and less sleep than her body required, and 3 conversations with a contact at the city's financial crimes unit who owed her a favor from a 2023 case, involving a restaurant chain that wasn't actually a restaurant chain. 4 days of following Brett Halden's money backward through 18 months of transactions, and what she found at the end of it was not what she'd expected to find. What she found was a name. The name belonged to a woman named Sylvia Crane, 41 years old, licensed real estate attorney, partner at a mid-sized firm in the Loop called Crane, Aldis, and Porter. Sylvia Crane had transferred money to a shell account connected to Brett Halden on 4 separate occasions over the previous 14 months. Not large amounts. 500 here, 800 there. The kind of numbers that could hide inside ordinary financial noise if you weren't looking for a pattern. Marsh had been looking for a pattern. Sylvia Crane was also, according to public corporate filings, that Marsh had read twice to make sure she was reading them correctly, a contracted legal consultant for 3 of Roman Caldrisi's legitimate real estate holding companies. Marsh sat with that for a long moment. She was in her car in the parking structure of the Area 3 building, because she'd found this in the last hour of her shift, and she hadn't wanted to be at her desk when she found it, hadn't wanted Reyes walking past and reading the thing on her face before she'd had time to decide what to do with the thing on her face. She sat in the cold car with the heat off and the engine running, and she read the filings a 3rd time. Sylvia Crane had access to Roman's business schedules, his property addresses, the operational details of his holdings, not the criminal infrastructure that existed in a different geography entirely, but the legitimate calendar, the legitimate addresses, which included the residential property at 900 north of Michigan, where Roman Caldrisi maintained a penthouse residence, where Zora Bellamy had been living for 8 months. Marsh put the papers down on the passenger seat and pressed both palms flat against the steering wheel and breathed out slowly through her nose. Someone inside Roman's professional world had been feeding Brett Halden information about Zora's location, her schedule, her movements, for over a year. Someone who attended meetings in glass-walled conference rooms and wore good shoes and billed by the hour had spent 14 months enabling a man with 2 restraining order violations to track his ex-wife. Marsh started the car and pulled out of the structure. She did not go back inside. She drove to the loop. Zora found out the way. She found out most things in those weeks, not from Roman directly, but from the shape of Roman's behavior, the particular geography of his silences and his movements, and the things he chose not to say that were louder than the things he said. He came home on Thursday evening at 7:30, which was 90 minutes earlier than his usual time, and he walked through the door without taking a call in the elevator the way he usually did, and he went directly to the kitchen and poured 2 glasses of water and set one on the counter near where Zora was reading, and sat down on the couch with his own without saying anything. She waited. Roman had told her once, early 3 weeks in, when she was still calibrating the difference between the public man and the private one, that he didn't perform emotions. He said it not as a point of pride, but as a practical statement, the way you'd explain a physical limitation. I don't perform them. When something is happening, I go quiet first. If you need an immediate response, it won't be a real one. She'd understood that. She'd needed time to understand it, but she'd gotten there. She put her book down. Tell me, she said. He looked at the glass in his hand. There's a problem with someone in my legal team. The words were careful. She could hear the carefulness in them, not the evasive kind, but the surgical kind, the kind where you were trying to deliver something without the delivery itself, causing damage before the information had a chance to be processed. Sylvia Crane, she said. He looked up. She shook her head slightly. I don't know her. But I know the look on your face, and it's not a look that goes with someone you've never introduced me to. The police talked to her today, Roman said. Detective Marsh. Not officially, Marsh went alone, didn't file it, which means she's either running something sideways or she found something she's not ready to put in a report yet. He set the glass down. Sylvia has been on contract with 3 of my holding companies for 2 years. She had access to building information, residential schedules. Zora was very still. She was providing information to Brett, she said. For 14 months. Teen months. Zora did the math without wanting to. 14 months ago, she had been living in the short-term rental on Dearborn Street, just her, before Roman, before any of this, still in the careful early reconstruction of a life she was trying to make livable. She'd thought she was doing it invisibly. She'd thought she was off the radar. She'd thought the restraining order violations had exhausted Brett's patience for the project of monitoring her. Why, she said. The question came out flat, genuinely confused. Why does she even know Brett? What is the connection? Roman was quiet for a moment. They know each other through a property deal from 2021. Brett was peripherally involved as a buyer's agent. Sylvia handled the legal work on the other side. He paused. And Sylvia has been trying to become a partner at her firm for 3 years. Brett apparently had some connection to one of the firm's senior partners, a personal connection, and offered to use it. The picture assembled itself in Zora's head with the brutal clarity of something that should have been obvious and wasn't. Brett had traded access, his social connection, to a senior partner for Sylvia's information about Roman's world, about Zora's world. He'd monetized his one useful piece of social capital in exchange for the ability to know where Zora was. For 14 months, he was building toward something, Zora said. Yes, the mall wasn't impulsive. No. She stood up, walked to the window. The city was lit in the way it lit up. At 7 in winter, the lights coming on in sequence as the dark arrived. The lake, invisible now against the sky. The traffic below moving in its hypnotic patterns. She stood there with her arms crossed and felt the specific sensation of a floor she'd trusted shifting under her. He planned it, she said. He spent 14 months planning to walk up to me in a public place and say those things. It appears so. All of it. The coat. The comment about the coat. She heard Brett's voice. That coat must have cost somebody a lot of money. Shame it doesn't fit better. 14 months of watching her, and he'd picked that specific moment, and he'd picked those specific words, and none of it had been the hot, careless cruelty she'd told herself it was. It had been prepared. He'd prepared it. He'd stood in a parking structure for 3 weeks watching vehicle logs so he could walk up to her with her defenses down and deliver something he'd been workshopping for over a year. Her stomach turned. Zora. Roman was behind her. Not touching, he didn't move toward physical contact when she was in this state, had learned early to read the difference between moments she wanted proximities and moments she needed space. What do you need? I need a minute, she said. He gave her the minute. Several of them. She stood at the window and looked at the city and felt the full weight of what it meant to have been watched for 14 months. Not just watched, studied. Filed. The information about her organized into something useful for a man who had told her, with his hand on her arm in a public place, that she was the kind of woman nobody chose. He'd stood in front of her and performed spontaneous cruelty when every word of it had been deliberate. That was, she realized, worse. The premeditation was worse than the cruelty itself, because the cruelty she could categorize as Brett being. Brett, the reflexive viciousness of a man who'd built his self-concept on diminishing the people around him. But the premeditation meant something different. It meant she'd occupied his thoughts for 14 months. It meant he'd structured a significant portion of his life around the project of reaching her. It meant she'd never actually been free. What happens to Sylvia Crane, she said. That's being handled. She turned from the window. Roman, what happens to her? He met her eyes. She'll lose her license. Her firm will lose several significant contracts. She won't practice in Illinois. A pause. She won't be physically harmed. This is a different category. Zora looked at him for a long moment. And Marsh. Marsh is a problem, Roman said, because Marsh found this independently, which means Marsh is good. And Marsh is running something she hasn't filed, which means she found something she thinks is bigger than Brett Halden, and she's not ready to show her hand. He picked up his glass and drank. She's going to keep pulling. On you. On everything adjacent to me. Including you. The room was very quiet. I didn't do anything wrong, Zora said. And then she heard the sentence and felt the particular inadequacy of it in the context of everything surrounding it, the technically true statements she'd made too. 2 detectives in this same room 4 days ago. The choice she'd made between one breath and the next about what she was and wasn't willing to say. The fact that Brett Halden's whereabouts were still officially unclear, and she had not asked Roman to clarify them, and he had not offered to. Roman looked at her. He said nothing. I didn't do anything wrong, she said again. Different emphasis this time, meaning something different. No, Roman said carefully. You didn't. But Marsh doesn't know that. Marsh knows what she can demonstrate. Right now she can demonstrate that someone in my organization provided information to Brett Halden. She can demonstrate that I have a history that makes any disappearance adjacent to my name look like something it may or may not be. He set the glass down. She can demonstrate that the woman living in my building was the ex-wife of the man who disappeared, and that the woman made a statement to investigators 4 days ago. Zora understood what he was saying. She's going to come back to me. Yes, and this time she'll know more. Yes. Zora pressed her fingers against the bruise on her arm lighter now. 5 days in, yellowing at the edges, the body quietly going about the business of reabsorption. She pressed it until she felt the last of the tenderness. I need to know something, she said, and I need you to tell me the truth. Not the version that protects me from knowing things. The actual truth. Roman waited. Is there anything that Marsh can find? Zora said, that connects me to whatever happened to Brett. Is there anything that I did, or said, or that someone can claim I said or did, That becomes evidence of something. He was very still for a moment. No, he said. What happened to Brett? He stopped. He was choosing words with the precision of a man who'd spent decades understanding exactly which words could be repeated and which couldn't. You were here. You were here from the time we arrived from the mall, and you were here when the detectives came. You spoke to Camille by phone. The building has you arriving and not leaving until the following morning. There is nothing that touches you. She absorbed that. She absorbed also the implication of everything he'd just said, the completeness of it, the detail, the way he'd laid out her timeline, with the quiet fluency of a man who had already reviewed it carefully. He'd checked. Before she'd even asked him, he'd checked. She didn't know how she felt about that. She filed it somewhere to figure out later. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. They stood in the penthouse with the city below them, and the weight of the last 5 days distributed between them unevenly, and Zora thought about Marsh in her coat pulling threads. And she thought about Sylvia Crane in a glass conference room, not knowing, yet that the floor had already gone out from under her. And she thought about a parking structure, and 14 months, and the specific architecture of being watched. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Camille. A text. Call me when you can. Not urgent, but call me. She called Camille at 9 p.m. from the bedroom with the door partially closed, which was her version of privacy in the penthouse, not fully closed, but angled enough that the conversation had a border. Someone called me today, Camille said. No preamble. Camille never used preamble when something was actually serious. Woman named Marsh, detective. Zora went cold. She called you directly. My cell, which I have not given to any detective, so she worked to find it. A pause. She said she wanted to talk to people in your life. Background. She was very Camille's voice shifted into a considered register. She was very careful about how she phrased everything. Not accusatory. The kind of careful that means she's working toward something and she doesn't want to tip it yet. What did you tell her? I told her I'd have my attorney present for any conversation. Then I called my attorney. Then I called you. Another pause. Zora, she asked about the gala. What gala? The Meridian Foundation thing. This Saturday. She asked whether you were still planning to attend. Zora's first thought was, how does Marsh know about the gala? Her second thought, arriving immediately behind it, Marsh had been pulling Roman's schedule. The gala was a public event with Roman's name attached to it, a significant charity function, photographed, attended by half of Chicago's visible power structure. Of course, Marsh knew about it. Her third thought was the one that stayed. Marsh was watching to see whether Zora would appear publicly after what had happened. Whether she'd retreat, go quiet, make herself small. Whether the behavior of a woman with nothing to hide looked different, the behavior of a woman with something to manage. She's watching the optics, Zora said. That's what I thought too, Camille said. If you go, it looks like I have nothing to be afraid of, Zora said. Or it looks like you're performing not being afraid. Those might be the same thing. Camille was quiet for a moment. What are you going to do? I'm going to the gala, Zora said. Roman's going to push back on that. Roman can push back all he wants. Zora, Camille. She heard the edge in her own voice and didn't soften it. I spent the last 20 minutes learning that Brett Halden spent 14 months planning a public confrontation designed to make me feel like I didn't belong in my own life. A detective is now watching to see if it worked. If I don't show up on Saturday, it worked. I'm not giving either of them that. Silence on Camille's end. Then, okay, what are you wearing? Despite everything, the weight of the room, the city outside, the thread that Marsh was pulling, Zora almost laughed. I don't know yet. We're going shopping tomorrow, Camille said. I'm coming at 10. Don't argue, I'm not arguing. You were building toward it. She hung up and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the floor for a moment. The carpet, the ordinary grain of it. She focused on it the way she'd learned to focus on small ordinary things, when the large things became too much to hold all at once. Then she stood up and went back to the living room. Roman was at his desk, working the desk lamp. The only light on that side of the room, the city spread behind him through the glass. He looked up when she came in. We're going to the gala, she said. He looked at her for a moment. She could see him running the calculation security, exposure, the optics of appearing publicly while Brett's disappearance was still open, the question of Marsh and what Marsh was building. She could see him working through all of it. Zora. We're going, she said. I need you to hear me on this. He looked at her. She held his gaze. Something passed across his face, not agreement. Exactly. More the recognition of a boundary being drawn by someone who had the right to draw it. Okay, he said. And I need a dress. I'll have someone. Camille's taking me tomorrow, her choice. She paused. I need it to not be something that tries to make me look smaller. He was quiet for a moment. It never is, he said. Not with you. She nodded, turned to go back to the bedroom. Zora. His voice stopped her at the doorway. She turned. He was looking at her from the desk, with the lamp making shadows across his face. I know this week has been I know what it cost you. To sit in this room and talk to those detectives. I know what you decided. She looked at him. I know what it means, he said. What you chose. She stood in the doorway and thought about the moment in the living room when Reyes had said unclear whereabouts, and she'd decided, in the space between two breaths, what she was going to say. She thought about what that decision had made her. What category it put her in. She'd been running from that thought for 5 days, and it was still there, and she suspected it would be there for considerably longer. Go to sleep, she said. You have a 7 a.m. call. She went to bed. She didn't sleep for 2 hours. Marsh found the second thread on Friday morning, and this one was different. This one didn't lead to Sylvia Crane, or to Brett Halden's money, or to the neat, followable geography of information for favors. This one led somewhere that made Marsh sit very still at her desk for a long time before she moved. She'd pulled the footage from 4 additional cameras near the Meridian shops, not the ones inside the building. Those had already been logged, but the street-level cameras from the city's traffic system. The ones that captured the block on all 4 sides between 12:15 and 5 p.m. on the day of the incident. At 3:47 p.m., 43 minutes after Brett Halden had walked out of the Meridian Shops' entrance, a vehicle she recognized from Roman Caldrisi's property management company, registered, legitimate, a company van with logo decals had pulled to the curb on Wabash, half a block from the building's secondary entrance. It had sat there for 11 minutes. Brett Halden, walking south on Wabash at 3:51 p.m., had passed directly alongside it. The van had pulled out 2 minutes later. It was not definitive. She knew it was not definitive. There were 11 different explanations for a company vehicle being parked on Wabash on a weekday afternoon. She listed them in her head, and they were plausible, and she believed exactly none of them, because the thing that Marsh had developed over 11 years, that she could not name and could not file, but could not ignore was the specific sensation of a coincidence that wasn't. She looked at the timestamp, 3:51 p.m. She looked at Brett Halden's last cell phone ping, which had come at 4:03 p.m. from a tower 3 blocks south of that position. 12 minutes. She closed the footage. She opened it again. She looked at the van for a long time. At the logo on the side, Caldrisi Property Group, in clean navy letters, completely ordinary, the kind of thing you drove past 40 times a day in a city this size, and never noticed. She picked up her phone and put it back down. She thought about what she had. She thought about what she could demonstrate. She thought about the difference between those two things and the specific terrain between them, where careers went to end. She pulled up Zora Bellamy's address, the penthouse, and the name of the event that was happening. Tomorrow night, the Meridian Foundation Gala, annual fundraiser, 7 p.m., the Whitmore Museum on South Michigan. She thought about Saturday. She thought, let's see who she is when everyone is watching. And in the penthouse 42 floors above the city, Zora Bellamy was standing in front of the mirror at 11 p.m. in the dark, with only the city's ambient glow coming through the window. Not looking at her reflection with the old inventory of complaint, not cataloging what was wrong, not apologizing to herself for the space she occupied, but doing something she'd only recently begun to do, which was simply looking. Just looking. A woman, 32 years old. Black and heavyset and tall and tired in the way you were tired after a week that had required her to make choices she'd spend years sitting with and still standing. Still here. Marsh was pulling threads. Sylvia Crane was about to lose everything. Brett Halden was nowhere. And tomorrow night, Zora Bellamy was going to put on a dress that didn't apologize for her. And she was going to walk into a room full of people who had opinions about what she was and what she was doing there. And she was going to look directly at every single one of them, because she had decided in the space between two breaths in a room with a detective who was very good at her job what kind of woman she was going to be. The question was whether she could hold that decision when the room pushed back. And the room, she already knew, was going to push back hard. The dress was emerald green. Camille had found it at a boutique on Oak Street that Zora had walked past 100 times without going in, because the window displays had always featured a particular type of woman, long, angular, the kind of body that fashion used as a canvas rather than a subject. But Camille had pulled her through the door with the focused energy of a woman on a mission, and the woman at the counter had looked at Zora once and gone to the back without being asked and come out with 3 options. And the emerald one had been the second. Floor length, heavy fabric that moved when she moved. Fitted through the body in a way that didn't minimize or redirect, just followed the actual shape of her, the full weight of her, without apology or architectural sleight of hand. Zora had stood in the fitting room and looked at herself for a long time. "Well," Camille said from outside the curtain, "give me a minute. I've given you 4. Camille, Zora, I can hear you breathing weird. Either you hate it or you love it, and either way you need to come out so I can tell you which one is correct." She came out. Camille looked at her. Camille had known Zora for 13 years, had seen her in the Wabash apartment with nothing left in her face, had seen her in the months after the divorce when she moved, like someone who was still expecting a blow from a direction that no longer existed. Camille was not a woman who performed reactions. When she looked at Zora in the emerald dress, her face did something quiet and real that Zora had to look away from. "That's the one," Camille said. "It's not trying to hide anything." "No," Camille said, "it's not." Zora looked at herself in the boutique mirror. The boutique mirror was unforgiving in the way that well-lit commercial mirrors were, showing everything, and what it showed was a heavy-set black woman in an emerald green dress that fit her like it had been made for her body and no other body, and she looked in the most unambiguous way she could assess it, like someone who had decided something. She bought the dress. Saturday arrived with the particular cold clarity of a Chicago winter day that had run out of clouds. The sky was the color of old pewter, and the air was sharp and honest, and the city moved through it in the brisk, purposeful way of a place that had never once pretended that winter was anything other than what it was. Roman was already in his suit when she came out of the bedroom at 6:15. He was at the window with coffee, looking at the lake, and he turned when he heard her and looked at her in the dress. And his face did the thing sometimes did, that micro-stillness, the briefest interruption of his habitual control, the one he probably didn't know she'd learned to read. "Okay," he said. Just that. She took it for what it was. His security lead, a man named Dario, who communicated primarily through eyebrow movements and monosyllables, had briefed them both at 5:30 about the evening's configuration. 2 vehicles, 4 men visible, 2 not. The Whitmore Museum had its own security for the event, which Dario had already coordinated with, meaning there would be an exchange of information about principles and threats that Zora tried not to think about too carefully. There had also been a brief mention of Detective Marsh that Dario delivered with the neutral tone of someone logging weather data. Marsh had made an inquiry to the event's organizers about the guest list. The organizers had confirmed the inquiry to Roman's office as a courtesy. Marsh was going to be there. Not as a guest, not officially, but there. Zora thought about that in the car, looking out at Michigan Avenue, going past. The museum was 12 minutes from the penthouse, and the streets were clear, and the city looked almost beautiful in its winter severity, the lights coming on in the early dark. She thought about Marsh watching the footage of her face on Tuesday. She thought about the thread that Marsh was pulling, and where it went, and whether there was an end to it, or whether threads like that just kept going until they found something they couldn't get past. "You're quiet," Roman said from beside her. "Marsh is going to be there." I know. That doesn't bother you. Everything bothers me, Roman said. I just don't perform it. He looked at her. What's your plan? When you see her, I don't have a plan. I'm going to a charity gala. Zora, Roman, she looked at him. I'm going to a charity gala. I'm going to be seen. I'm going to have a glass of wine and talk to people I mostly don't know and stand in a room and take up space. That's it. That's the plan. He held her gaze for a moment. And if someone makes it difficult, then I'll handle difficult. And if I want to handle it for you, then I'll tell you when that's appropriate and when it isn't. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The thing that a smile would be if it were made of different material. You know the specific list of people who'll be in that room tonight, he said. Some of them are people I do business with. Some of them are people I have other relationships with. It's not going to be a comfortable room. Was it going to be comfortable before this week? No. Then we're in the same position we were always going to be in. He nodded slowly. Outside, the museum appeared at the end of the block, a wide stone building, lit for the event, cars already queued at the entrance, people moving in the cold between their vehicles and the warm mouth of the lobby. Even from the car, Zora could see the density of it. The event was large, full, the kind of Chicago gathering that happened when significant money wanted to be seen doing something meaningful. She put her hand flat on her thigh and pressed down once and felt the fabric of the dress and breathed. The ballroom was enormous and deliberately beautiful, in the way that wealth made room beautiful, not warmth, but scale, the kind of grandeur that was meant to make individual humans feel appropriately small. Crystal chandelier clusters suspended from the ceiling at varying heights. Table set with the specific precision of people who got paid to set tables with precision. A small orchestra in the far corner playing at the volume of background rather than foreground, audible but deniable. 400 people, roughly. The room did not go silent when they entered. That happened in movies. What happened in reality was more interesting and more uncomfortable, a series of small, sequential reactions, like a stones dropped in still water, ripples moving outward from the entry point. The nearest cluster of people registered Roman first, because they always registered Roman first, and then they registered what was beside Roman, and then their faces did the small work of recalibrating. Zora felt it. She'd been feeling it for 8 months, the particular texture of a room adjusting to her presence. Sometimes the adjustment was gracious. Sometimes it wasn't. Tonight the room was sorting itself, and she could track the sorting in her peripheral vision, the way certain faces turned toward their neighbors, and certain conversations stuttered and restarted. She kept her chin level, kept her shoulders back, kept moving. Roman had a hand at her lower back, not gripping, not guiding, just present, the light contact that communicated what it communicated to the people reading the room. She was aware of it. She was aware that she wasn't uncomfortable with it, which was itself something she'd needed 8 months to arrive at. The first 20 minutes were navigation. Roman worked the room the way he worked everything, methodical, unhurried, his attention landing on each interaction with complete presence before moving to the next. He introduced Zora to people whose names she clocked and filed, a city alderman whose handshake was too firm, a hospital foundation director whose smile went all the way up, a property developer from the North Shore who looked at Zora with the specific blankness of some choosing not to react. She held the conversations, carried her weight in them, did not perform graciousness, but also did not withhold it when it was warranted. She was on her second glass of wine mineral water in her left hand, wine she wasn't really drinking in her right. A configuration she'd developed for events where she wanted to appear at ease without actually dulling her attention when she felt the shift. Not a sound, not a movement, just the particular quality of attention in a room changing direction. She found the source before she consciously decided to look for it. Dante Veyron had arrived. She'd heard the name. Roman had mentioned it twice. In the months they'd been together, both times briefly, and with the particular economy of language he used for things that required genuine care. Dante Veyron was 53, ran interests in the western suburbs and portions of Indiana, and had been in a Cold War configuration with Roman's organization for the better part of 4 years, not active conflict. but the kind of competitive proximity that required constant maintenance. He was not Roman's enemy. He was not Roman's ally. He was the kind of man who existed in the specific category of contingent. And contingent men at large public events were, according to Roman's private geography, the most complicated kind to manage. Veyron was not a large man. He was well dressed in the way that men who'd grown up without money dressed when they finally had it slightly too deliberate, every element chosen rather than assumed. He had a broad face and small, quick eyes that moved over a room the way you moved over a document you were looking for something specific in. His eyes found Roman, then they found Zora. They stayed on Zora for approximately 3 seconds, the length of a full assessment, and then moved back to Roman. And Zora saw in those 3 seconds the thing that Camille had articulated in the car on the way to the mall, the calculation men made about the women beside powerful men. Was she decorative? Was she functional? Was she a liability? Was she leverage? She watched Veyron decide. He began moving through the room toward them. Roman had already clocked it. She could tell by the half-inch shift in his posture, not tensings exactly, more like the subtle realignment of a system bringing itself to ready. He didn't stop the conversation he was in. He finished the sentence he was finishing about a proposed lakefront zoning change, and then turned to include Zora in the natural transition, and she moved with it, and by the time Veyron arrived, they were facing him as a unit. Roman. Veyron's voice was medium smooth, the practiced warmth of a man who'd learned that warmth cost nothing and bought considerable goodwill. He offered his hand and Roman shook it with the brief, complete pressure of a man who measured everything. Good to see you out, Dante. Equally warm, equally complete. You know Zora Bellamy. Veyron turned to her, the eyes again quick, specific. I don't believe I've had the pleasure. He extended his hand. Dante Veyron. She shook it. His grip was calibrated, firm enough to communicate. He took her seriously. Brief enough to communicate he wasn't committing to anything. Zora, she said. Zora. He repeated the name the way people repeated names when they were filing them. Roman speaks highly of you. Roman doesn't speak highly of anyone, Zora said. He either trusts someone or he doesn't. I've been told I'm in the first category. Veyron blinked. A half-second recalibration, he'd expected something different. Modesty, maybe. Or the performed confidence of a woman who knew her audience. He hadn't expected that specific flatness. Fair enough, he said, and there was something in it that might have been actual amusement. They talked, the three of them, for 6 minutes. Veyron was good at conversation, the way certain men were good at it, not through charm exactly, but through a quality of attention that made you feel temporarily like the only interesting person in the room. He asked Zora 2 direct questions about her work, answered her 1 direct question about his own with appropriate vagueness, and managed the whole exchange with the fluency of someone who'd been doing this at this level for a long time. Then, as if the thought had arrived naturally in the conversation's flow, as if it weren't the thing he'd crossed the room to deliver, he said, I heard about the unpleasantness this week. The situation with your ex-husband. The room's ambient noise continued around them. The orchestra played. 400 people moved and drank and performed their social obligations. Zora looked at Veyron and felt the specific quality of attention sharpen in her chest. News travels, she said. In certain circles, Veyron said. He glanced at Roman, the briefest glance, the kind that communicated that what he was about to say was intended for Roman while being addressed to Zora, which was itself a form of disrespect, so precisely calibrated that it almost qualified as art. I'll say this gently, because I mean it gently. Situations like that have a way of creating exposure. For everyone adjacent, Roman was very still. Exposure, Zora said. Attention from certain parties who might otherwise stay in their lane. Veyron's eyes moved back to her. I've always felt that a man in Roman's position benefits from a quiet, private life. Uncomplicated. I mean no offense by that. Of course you don't, Zora said. It's just a practical observation. It is, she said. It's also an observation about what you think my presence costs him, which is a different thing from being practical. Veyron looked at her. The amusement from earlier was gone. gone. In its place was something more honest at a conversation, expecting to manage it, and found that the management had already been done without him. "You're very direct," he said. "I used to not be," Zora said. "I spent a lot of years softening things so other people would be more comfortable. I've found that the results weren't worth the effort." Roman said nothing. He was watching. She was aware of him watching and of the specific quality of it, not anxious, not ready to intervene. Something else. Something that she would catalog later when she had the room to think. "Let me be direct back," Veyron said, and the warmth left his voice with the clean efficiency of a light being switched off. "Roman is in a delicate position right now. There are people watching his situation. Business people. People with interests that require stability. A missing person adjacent to his home, a police investigation circling his operation, and now a public appearance, that is." He looked at Zora. Not with contempt exactly. More clinical than that. The look of a man pricing something. "Provocative," he finished. "Provocative," Zora said, "to certain people, to you." He stopped. She looked at him with a steadiness that she felt, in a real and physical way, in her sternum, a stillness that started there and radiated outward, through her shoulders, down her arms, into the hand, holding the wine she wasn't drinking. She'd been afraid of men like this once. Not the violence they could access. She'd made a certain peace with the geography of Roman's world and its possible consequences, but the specific social power of men who'd learned to package contempt as concern. Who'd gotten very good at making the person being diminished feel like they were being helped. Brett had been a minor league version of this. Veyron was the professional circuit. "I'm provocative," she said, "because I'm here. And I'm here because I was here last week, and I'll be here next week. And nobody in this room or any other room gets to factor me into the calculus of what Roman should or shouldn't do, because I'm not a variable in his equation. I'm a separate person standing next to him, because we both decided that was where we wanted to be." She paused. "Now, if you have business concerns, you know how to reach his office. If you have a social point to make, you've made it, and I've answered it. So unless there's something else," she let the sentence end without completing it. The something else was implicit, and they all understood it. Veyron looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Roman. Roman met his gaze with the complete, flat attention of a man who had made no move to intervene and made no apology for it. "Zora," Veyron said finally, and there was something new in his voice, not quite respect, but the pre-respect that preceded respect, the moment of recognition before a man conceded he'd misjudged the terrain. It was a pleasure. He walked away. The crowd absorbed him. Roman turned to Zora. She was looking at the middle distance past the chandeliers, at nothing specific. She was breathing in the deliberate way she breathed when she needed her body to catch up to what she'd just done. "You didn't need me to do that," Roman said. "It wasn't a question." "No," she said. "I know, a beat. I also know what it cost." She looked at him. "How much did you hear of what he said before you walked over?" "All of it." "And you were going to yes," Roman said simply. "And you stopped it." She nodded once. The ballroom continued around them. 400 people who'd watched the last 3 minutes from their peripheral vision, who were now reconstructing what they'd seen into versions that their existing phrase. She was aware of the reconstruction happening. She was also, for the first time that evening, aware that she didn't particularly care how it came out. She drank the wine. It was good wine. She hadn't expected to notice that. Marsh appeared at 9:47. Zora saw her first, not because she was looking for her, but because Marsh moved through the room with the specific purposefulness of someone who wasn't there to enjoy it. And purposefulness in a room full of people performing ease was visible from across a ballroom. She was in a dark blazer, not dressed for the event, standing near the room's east entrance with the still, comprehensive attention of someone taking inventory. Their eyes met across the room. Neither of them looked away immediately. Then Marsh began moving. Zora set her wine glass on a passing tray. She said quietly, "To Roman, Marsh is here. She's coming toward us. I need you to let me talk to her first." Roman clocked Marsh's position without appearing to move. "Zora, Roman. Let me talk to her first. A beat." Okay, Marsh arrived with the momentum of someone who decided something on the walk across the room. She was 40 feet away, then 30, then 15. And up close she was younger than she'd looked in the penthouse early 30s, maybe, with the particular aged-in quality of someone who'd seen a lot in a compressed period. Her eyes were dark and quick, and they did the thing Zora had noticed. In the penthouse, they took inventory without announcing themselves. "Miss Bellamy," she said. Detective Zora didn't offer her hand. Not hostile, just accurate. They were not in a handshaking configuration. "This is Roman Caldrisi. I know who Mr. Caldrisi is." Marsh's eyes moved to Roman for exactly 1 second, then back to Zora. The choice of where to direct herself was deliberate. She was looking at Zora because Zora was the conversation she'd come to have. "I'm sorry to interrupt your evening." "You're not sorry," Zora said. "But that's all right. What do you need?" Marsh almost smiled. "Almost. I've been reviewing the footage from the Meridian shops again. I assumed. I've also been looking at some additional footage. Street level. From Tuesday afternoon." She paused. The pause was doing work, giving the information room to settle. Watching what happened to faces while it settled. "There's a vehicle I'm trying to identify. Property management van. Parked on Wabash around the time Mr. Halden left the building." The ballroom was loud enough that this conversation was private. Not quiet, the orchestra and 400 people generated considerable sound but contained. Zora was aware of Roman beside her, absolutely still, the stillness of a man who had heard exactly what Marsh had just said and was letting it arrive without reaction. "I'm not sure what that has to do with me," Zora said. "Probably nothing," Marsh said, carefully. "I'm still establishing context." Part of that context is, she looked at Zora directly. "I want to understand who you are. Not in relation to Mr. Caldrisi. Not in relation to Brett Halden. Who you are as a separate person." Zora looked at her. "Why?" "Because I've been doing this long enough to know that when a case has a lot of people, with a lot of interests, pulling in different directions, sometimes the clearest picture of what actually happened is the one that doesn't belong to any of them." A pause. "I think you see this situation very clearly, Ms. Bellamy." "I see it from where I'm standing. That's usually the clearest view," Marsh said. "And I think—" She stopped. She chose her next words the way someone chose footing on uncertain ground. "I think you made a choice in that living room last Tuesday. I think it was a real choice, and you made it quickly, and you've been living with it since. I'm not here to condemn that choice." Another pause. "But I am going to find what I'm looking for. I want you to know that." Zora held her gaze. Marsh's eyes were steady and serious and held no performance in them, no intimidation tactic, no power display. Just a woman doing her job, telling the truth about it, with the specific directness of someone who decided that honesty was the more efficient strategy. "I respect that," Zora said. "I respect that you're going to keep looking. You're not worried about what I'll find." "I'm worried about a lot of things," Zora said. "That's not one of them." Marsh looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked, for the first time with real attention, at Roman. And Roman looked back with the absolute, unreadable stillness he brought to everything important. And for 3 seconds, the three of them stood in that ballroom with the orchestra playing and 400 people performing their carefully maintained lives. And the weight of the week hung between them, like something that hadn't yet decided which way to fall. Then Veyron's voice cut through it from 15 feet away, raised, sharp, directed at Roman with the specific aggression of a man who had reconsidered the outcome of an earlier conversation and wanted a different one. "Caldrisi. Not warm this time, the warmth fully gone. We need to finish what we started." The room's ambient temperature changed. Not the air, something else. The specific atmosphere of a large social gathering, registering that something was no longer social. Roman turned, and across the ballroom, near the bar, 2 of Veyron's men were repositioning. Not toward Roman, toward the exit. Toward the position that if you were reading the room, the way Dario had trained himself to read rooms, would cut off a particular path if someone needed to use it quickly. Dario had already moved. Zora felt, rather than saw it, the quiet shift in the configuration of the people nearest to her, the subtle redistribution of Roman's security into a geometry that meant something had been assessed and responded to. Marsh went very still. She was reading it too. Veyron crossed the remaining distance between himself and Roman with the stride of a man who had decided the evening's social contract was no longer operative, and he stopped 3 feet away and said, low and controlled and carrying an edge that hadn't been there before, the situation with the police. You're going to become a problem for a lot of people if you can't contain it. You understand that. This isn't the place, Roman said. I decide where the place is. Roman looked at him. The look that Zora had heard described by people who'd been on the receiving end of it and had felt the need to describe it afterward, usually in the past tense, complete, undivided, the look of a man who had weighed something and arrived at a conclusion and was now simply implementing it. No, Roman said, you don't. Veyron's jaw tightened. A muscle moved in his neck. The small, visible signs of a man whose body was having a reaction his discipline was working to suppress. You want to have this conversation here. Fine. Here. He gestured a small, controlled sweep of his hand that managed to include Zora in its arc. She is the problem. Whatever happened with Halden, she is the thread that Marsh keeps pulling. You remove the thread. Careful, Roman said. I'm being careful. I'm being very Dante. Roman's voice was quiet and absolute. The next sentence you're about to say, don't say it. The room had quieted around them in a radius of approximately 20 feet. The people in that radius were performing not listening, with the full concentration of people who were listening with everything they had. Marsh had her hand near her jacket. Zora looked at Veyron. She looked at him with the full weight of what the week had been Brett's hand on her arm, the bruise that was still yellowing on her skin, the detectives in her living room, 14 months of being watched. Sylvia Crane and her careful transfers of small amounts of money, the technically true statements she'd made, and the choice she'd made between breaths. She looked at him with all of it, and what she felt was not fear. What she felt was something that had been building since Tuesday afternoon in a shopping center, and had been looking for the right container, and had finally found it. She stepped forward, not toward Roman, not toward Veyron's men. Toward Veyron himself, the step was small, deliberate, and it did something to the geometry of the confrontation that no one in the radius of 20 feet had anticipated, because the move that the room had been waiting for was Roman's move, and the move that arrived was hers, and nobody, not Veyron, not his men, not Marsh, with her hand near her jacket, had their attention positioned for Zora Bellamy to be the one who stepped forward. She stopped 1 foot from Veyron. She was taller than him. She hadn't realized until this moment that she was taller than him. The emerald dress, and her heels, and the full height of her, and she stood in it and looked down at him with a steadiness that came from somewhere she hadn't had access to before this week, before the decisions she'd made, before sitting across from Reyes and Marsh and choosing her technically true statements with a clarity that had surprised her. So, I'm the thread, she said. Low. Even. You just told this room that the solution to your problem is me. You want to think carefully about what you just admitted. Veyron blinked. You admitted, Zota said, that you're afraid of me. Not of Roman's legal situation. Not of the police investigation. Of me specifically. A woman you met 40 minutes ago. She held his gaze. What does that tell you about your calculation? The 20-foot radius was completely silent. Veyron's face was doing something complicated, the expressions moving through it in rapid succession. The anger and the recalibration, and underneath both of those, something that was beginning to look, against every apparent intention, like acknowledgement. He looked past her at Roman. Roman was watching Zora with an expression she'd never seen on him before. She didn't have a name for it yet. Veyron looked back at Zora. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, Marsh stepped forward from her position and said, clearly into the silence, Mr. Veyron, I'm going to need you to step outside with me. Veyron turned to her. The anger redirected easier to aim at the detective than at the woman who had just dismantled him in a ballroom. I'm at a private event. You can step outside voluntarily, Marsh said, or I can make it less voluntary. Either way works for me. A beat. Veyron straightened. He looked once more at Roman, then at Zora, and in the look was something that would take Zora a long time afterward to fully read it. Wasn't defeat, wasn't exactly respect, was something more unstable than either. He walked toward the exit. Marsh followed him. At the door, she stopped and looked back at Zora across the distance of the ballroom, the full length of the enormous room. 400 people, and their reconstructed versions of what they'd just witnessed. The orchestra picking its melody back up again, the chandelier light finding the green of Zora's dress and doing something with it. Marsh looked at her. Zora looked back. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Marsh nodded small, private, the acknowledgement of one woman to another who had just done something that required a particular quality of nerve, and she turned and walked through the door. And the room exhaled. And Roman Caldrisi, feared by men who had never imagined what his private world looked like, turned to the woman standing beside him in an emerald dress, in the remains of the confrontation she had just redirected with a single step, and a question. And he said quiet, "For only her, we should talk about the gala next month." She looked at him. "I'm assuming you'll want to go," he said. And despite the week, despite Marsh, despite the weight of everything that was still unresolved, and still in motion, and still going to require her to navigate terrain she'd never been trained for, despite all of it, something in her chest loosened like a knot that had been pulled too tight for too long. "Obviously," she said. The orchestra played. The room continued around them. And somewhere near the museum's east exit, Detective Marsh was asking Dante Veyron a question he didn't want to answer. And the thread was still being pulled, and the night was not over, and nothing had been fully resolved. But Zora Bellamy was standing in the middle of it in an emerald dress that fit her like it had been made for her body and no other body. And she was not waiting for anyone's permission to be there. And the room for the first time felt like it understood that. The museum's east exit led out onto a narrow side street that ran between the building and a parking structure. And in winter, that particular corridor became a wind tunnel, the cold finding the gap between the two buildings and accelerating through it with the specific cruelty of Chicago geometry. Marsh stood in it with Veyron and felt the cold hitting the back of her neck and didn't move to adjust her collar because she needed both hands visible and both eyes on the man in front of her. Veyron had his arms crossed. He was doing the thing that men who'd spent decades in rooms where they controlled the temperature did when they found themselves outside. That control he was recalibrating, visibly, rebuilding the composed surface that Zora had stripped away in the ballroom. It was taking him longer than he'd like. Marsh could see that it was taking him longer than he'd like, and she gave him the time, because a man who was still recalibrating was a man whose edges were still exposed. "You're not going to find what you're looking for," Veyron said. His voice was back to the medium, smooth register. Not all the way there, a roughness underneath it that wasn't usually audible. "Whatever you think happened to Halden, you're not going to be able to demonstrate it." "Maybe not," Marsh said. "Then what are we doing out here?" "I wanted to ask you something," Marsh said. "Off the record. You're not obligated to answer, and I'm not recording this. I just want to understand something." He looked at her. Suspicious. The suspicion of a man who'd been in enough rooms with enough investigators to know that "off the record" was a phrase with a complex relationship to its own definition. "The woman in that room," Marsh said. "Zora Bellamy. What did you think was going to happen when you said what you said to Roman Caldrisi?" Veyron was quiet for a moment. "I was making a business point. You were suggesting that the solution to Roman's exposure was removing her from the equation. In a room full of witnesses. At a public event." Marsh looked at him. "That's not a business point. That's a mistake. And you're not a man who makes mistakes like that in public." She paused. "So I want to know what you thought was going to happen." Something shifted in Veyron's face. Not the recalibration this time. Something more honest than that. Something that arrived against his apparent preference. "I thought," he said slowly, "that she'd step back. Let Roman handle it. Like women in that situation in his world usually do." "And she didn't." "No," Veyron said. "She didn't." Marsh nodded. She pulled her collar up against the wind, finally, because she was finished with both hands, needing to be visible. "For what it's worth," she said, "I don't think you're the person I'm actually looking for. I think you're a man who made a bad read on a situation and said something out loud that you should have kept to yourself." She looked at him steadily. "I need you to stay available. I'm going to have formal questions for you in the next week about some financial movements connected to Brett Halden." Not because I think you're directly connected, because I think you might know someone who is. Veyron absorbed that. The specific quality of his stillness changed the relief of someone who'd just been told the thing they were afraid of wasn't the thing that was coming, followed immediately by the different anxiety of the thing that was actually coming. You're going to tell me who? Not yet, Marsh said. When I'm ready, she turned to go back inside. Mr. Veyron, go back to your table. Eat the dinner. Make a donation to the foundation. Go home. She went back in through the side door. The corridor with its wind tunnel cold returned to being a corridor. Marsh found Reyes waiting for her just inside the east entrance, which meant Reyes had been notified she was here, which meant someone in the event's security had made a call, which meant the evening had generated more paper than Marsh had intended. Reyes looked at her with the measuring patience of a man who'd been doing this for 22 years and had developed a comprehensive tolerance for his partner's unilateral decisions. You want to tell me, he said, why I'm getting a call on a Saturday night that my partner is at the Meridian Foundation Gala. I was following up on something. Informally, very informally. Marsh. His voice wasn't angry. It was the voice he used when he was being deliberate about not being angry, which she'd learned to read as the more serious register. What did you find? She looked at him. They were in the museum's secondary corridor, Farah Irvis Hall, with institutional lighting that made both of them look like they hadn't slept properly in a week, which, in Marsh's case, was accurate. She told him about the van, the timestamp, the cell tower ping, Brett Halden's last known position 12 minutes after a Caldrisi Property Group vehicle had sat parked on Wabash at the exact junction of the timeline. Reyes listened without interrupting, which was the thing she valued most about him. When she finished, he looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked at her. That's not enough, he said. I know. It's not even close to enough. I know that too. So, what are you doing here tonight, instead of building towards something that's actually enough? Marsh was quiet for a moment. The institutional lighting hummed. From somewhere beyond the corridor walls, the orchestra started a new piece, something with strings, something that in a different context might have been beautiful. I wanted to see her, Marsh said. Reyes looked at her. I wanted to see who she was, Marsh said, when it was real, when there were people pushing and the stakes were actual. I'd seen her in a living room, telling me technically true things in a very controlled way, and I'd seen her in footage from a mall, and I needed to see her in a room where she didn't have time to prepare. And Marsh thought about the moment in the ballroom. The emerald dress, the single step forward, the question Zora had asked Veyron that had accomplished in 5 words what Roman's security configuration hadn't needed to attempt. And she's not what I thought she was, Marsh said. Reyes waited. I thought she was someone who'd been swept up in something, Marsh said. Who'd made choices to stay near Roman Caldrisi and was managing the consequences of that proximity. I thought the choice in the living room, the technically true statements, the careful version of events, I thought that was a woman protecting a man she was afraid of losing. She paused. It's not that. What is it? She's protecting herself, Marsh said. She knows exactly where the line is, and she's standing right on it. Not over it. On it. And she's going to stay there no matter what I pull. Reyes was quiet for a moment. That's not exculpatory. No, Marsh agreed. It's not, Marsh. He looked at her with the full weight of 22 years of this specific work. Are you going to be able to close this case? She looked at Adam. The honest answer was complicated. The honest answer was, she could probably build something around the van, the timestamp, the cell tower. She could subpoena the employment records for the driver. She could pull the van's GPS data from the company's fleet management system with a warrant she had reasonable grounds to request. She could build a timeline that got her very close to something she could take to the state's attorney. Very close. And then she'd hit the wall that Caldrisi's attorneys had spent years constructing and maintaining. And on the other side of that wall was a man who knew exactly where every edge of his exposure was and had built his life to stay one step inside it. And next to that man was a woman who had sat across from her in a penthouse, in a penthouse living room, and told technically true things with the steadiness of someone who had already done the internal accounting and made her peace with the number. I'm going to close it, Marsh said. I just need to know what closing it actually means. She went back into the ballroom. Zora was in the car by 10:15. Not because the evening had ended badly, it hadn't, or at least not in the direction she'd been preparing for. After Veyron's exit, the ballroom had done the thing ballrooms did, absorbed the disruption, redistributed the conversational energy, performed the collective amnesia of people who needed the evening to be fine. There'd been a dinner she'd eaten without tasting much of it. There'd been a brief speech from the Foundation's director about clean water initiatives in 3 countries. There'd been the particular social marathon of a large event's final hour, where everyone was tired, but no one wanted to be the first to leave. Roman had found excuses to keep them in conversations that were deliberately low stakes. An architect she'd genuinely enjoyed talking to. A woman who ran a mentorship organization on the South Side, who'd asked Zora direct questions about her own background and seemed actually interested in the answers. Small islands of ordinary in an evening that had been anything but. In the car, with the city going past, and Dario in the front seat and Roman beside her, she felt the week land on her all at once. The way it sometimes happened, you held the weight, while the weight needed to be held, and then when the holding was over your body, presented the bill. Her shoulders ached. Her feet hurt in the heels she'd been wearing for 4 hours. There was a headache starting at the base of her skull that hadn't been there 20 minutes ago. She sat the back seat of the car and felt all of it arriving simultaneously and said nothing, because saying something would have required a version of her that she'd used up. Roman put his hand over hers. He didn't say anything either. They rode the 12 minutes to the building in silence, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who'd been through something together and were in the part that came after, where language was the less precise instrument. 3 days later, Marsh filed her report. Zora knew about it because Marcus Teal called Roman at 8 in the morning, and Roman called Zora from his office at 8:40 and told her in the measured, complete way. He told her things that the report had been filed and what it contained. The GPS data from the company van had been subpoenaed. The driver, a man named Terrence, 9 years, with the property management division, had been interviewed for 4 hours. Terrence had said nothing that required him to say anything further, which was a sentence Roman used that Zora understood to have a specific meaning. The report concluded that Brett Halden's disappearance remained open, that there was insufficient evidence to file charges in connection with any specific individual or organization, that the investigation would remain active. That was the official language. The unofficial language, which Thiel had read between the lines and translated for Roman, and Roman translated for Zora, was that Marsh had taken the case as far as she could take it with what she had, and what she had wasn't enough. And the state's attorney's office had agreed with that assessment, and the file would sit open but inactive until something new came into it. Nothing new was going to come into it. Zora sat with the phone in her hand after Roman hung up and looked at the lake through the penthouse window. The ice had fully formed now along the shore. The shallow parts that had been working stillness the sea for weeks had finally committed, locked the surface, gone quiet. The open water further out was still moving. She sat there for a long time. She was not, she told herself, relieved. Relief would have implied she'd been afraid of what Marsh would find, and she was trying to be precise about what she actually felt, which was more complicated than relief. It was closer to the feeling of setting down something heavy that you'd been carrying. For so long you'd stopped noticing the weight the setting down, followed by the strange sensation of your own arms without. The load, lighter than you expected, almost unfamiliar. Brett Halden had been gone for 10 days. The restraining orders she'd kept folded in her purse, carried through the last 3 years as a talisman and a reminder and a small legal document that meant the law acknowledged he was real and his behavior was real, she'd transferred them 2 days ago to a file in the back of a cabinet. Not thrown away, not destroyed, just filed, moved from the category of immediate to the category of documented history. She thought about what it meant to file something. The act of putting it somewhere that wasn't on her body. She got up, and she made coffee, and she stood at the window while it brewed. Sylvia Crane resigned from Crane. Aldous and Porter on a Wednesday, citing personal reasons, which everyone in the firm understood to mean reasons they weren't going to ask about. The 3 contracts she'd managed for Roman's holding companies were terminated by mutual agreement and without litigation, which was the version of Roman's displeasure that expressed itself through the orderly removal of everything, rather than its destruction. Her license review was pending before the state bar. Zora heard about this through Roman, 3 weeks after the gala, in the same measured way she heard about most things in his world, completely, concisely, and without editorializing. He told her and waited for her response. She sat with it. She thought about a woman she'd never met who had spent 14 months passing small pieces of information to a man who used them to watch her. She thought about what moved a person to do that, what combination of ambition and small moral calculations made that sequence of choices feel navigable. She thought about the $500, the $800, the specific ordinariness of the amounts. Is she going to be okay? Zora said. Roman looked at her. She'll survive. That's not what I asked. He was quiet for a moment. She'll lose the license. The firm is done for her. She has money, she's not destitute. He paused. She made choices. I know she made choices. Zora looked at her hands. I'm not asking because I want you to go easier on her. I'm asking because I need to know what the answer is. She wasn't sure she could explain what she meant by that, even to herself. She thought it had something to do with the weight she'd been examining. Since the file went inactive, the weight of the choice she'd made in the living room, the things she'd said and hadn't said, the line she'd stood on with care. She needed to know what happened to the people at the edges of what she'd chosen, because those people were part of the full accounting, and she intended to do the full accounting. She'll survive, Roman said again, gentler this time. But she won't be comfortable. Zora nodded once. It was not satisfaction. It was something else, the acknowledgement that consequence had arrived, and that consequence was real, and that this was the world as it actually operated, rather than the world as it was supposed to operate, and she was living in it with her eyes open. Okay, she said. Camille came over on a Thursday afternoon 6 weeks after the gala, which was now late February, the city beginning the preliminary negotiations, with the idea of spring not actually warming, but the quality of the light shifting, something in the air suggesting that the cold was at least considering its options. Set in the kitchen coffee. They sat in the kitchen with coffee and talked about nothing important for 40 minutes. Was one of the things Zora valued most about Camille, the ability to be in the same room with nothing required of the time. They talked about a documentary they'd both watched. They talked about Camille's situation at her architecture firm, a personnel conflict that was specific and complicated and had nothing to do with Roman or Brett or Marsh or emerald dresses. They talked the way women who'd known each other for 13 years talked when the crisis had receded enough to have a conversation about the documentary. Then Camille set her mug down and looked at Zora the way she looked at her when she'd been working up to something for 20 minutes. How are you? Camille said. Actually, Zora thought about the question. She gave it the space it was asking for. I don't know yet, she said finally. I think I'm still in the part where I don't know. That's okay. It doesn't feel okay. It never does. Camille wrapped both hands around her mug. You made a hard choice. You're going to be making it for a while, not again, but in the sense of living with it. That takes time to settle into a shape. You're not going to ask me about it. No, Camille said. I'm not. Because you don't want to know. Because it's not mine to know, Camille said. I trust that you know who you are, and you know what you did and didn't do. That's enough for me. She paused. Is it enough for you? Zora looked at the window. The lake was still half-iced, the winter releasing its hold in sections. A gray sky, with somewhere behind it the memory of blue. I'm working on it, she said. It was the most honest answer she had. Camille picked up her mug. Good enough, she said. Tell me about the organization you're setting up. Roman mentioned it when I saw him last week. Zora looked at her. Roman mentioned it, in passing. He said you were working with someone who runs a women's services organization. Said you had opinions about how it should be structured. I have opinions about how it shouldn't be structured, Zora said. Specifically, that it shouldn't be structured around Roman's money, in any way that gives Roman's world influence over how it operates. Is he okay with that? He didn't love it initially. Then I explained why, and he came around. Camille tilted her head slightly. You explained why. It took about 40 minutes. 40 minutes. He's not always immediately receptive to the first version of a point, Zora said. But he processes things. He's a processor. She paused. He came around. Camille looked at her with the specific attention of a woman, cataloging something she found significant. You know what's different, Camille said. A lot is different. I mean specifically, the way you talk about him now versus 6 months ago. She paused. 6 months ago, you talked about him, like you were still waiting to find out if it was real. Like you were holding the information at arm's length, in case you needed to give it back. Another pause. You're not doing that anymore. Zora thought about that. She thought about standing in front of the mirror in the dark, just looking. She thought about the bruise that had fully faded now, not even a shadow of it left. The skin returned to its ordinary self. She thought about the van on Wabash and the choice between 2 breaths and the file in the cabinet and the specific feeling of arms without a weight they'd been carrying. No, she said. I'm not doing that anymore. In the first week of March, she went back to the Meridian shops alone. It wasn't planned or not consciously. She was in the neighborhood for a meeting with the director of the organization she was helping restructure, a practical woman named Dr. Adeze Okafor, who had opinions about governance frameworks that Zora found genuinely interesting. And the meeting ran long and let out at 2:30, and Zora found herself on Michigan Avenue in the pale March light, with an hour before she needed to be anywhere. She stood on the sidewalk outside the building. She looked at the entrance. The same glass doors, the same marble lobby visible through them, the same arrangement of boutiques and the coffee counter, somewhere inside, where she'd been standing when she'd heard his voice. She went in. She bought coffee the way she actually liked it, 2 sugars. Enough cream, and she stood at the counter and drank it and looked at the spot near the storefront where his hand had closed around her arm. And she stayed with what she felt when she looked at it. Not nothing. It would be a long time before it was nothing. She understood that. The body had its own filing system, and it didn't reorganize on request. She felt the ghost of the grip. She felt the specific cold of that Tuesday afternoon, and the phones rising, and the crowd deciding to classify it as something else. She also felt that she was standing there, in the same spot, with coffee she'd bought herself, in a coat she'd chosen because she liked it, and the room was not arranging itself around her absence, and she was not making herself smaller, and the ghost of the grip was a ghost present, real, not gone, but it was her history now, and not her present, and those were different categories. She finished the coffee. She stood there another 3 minutes because she wanted to, not because she was proving something. Then she left. March became April without ceremony. The way seasons changed in the Midwest, not a transformation but an argument. The cold conceding ground slowly, unevenly, the warmth arriving in fits. The investigation into Brett Halden's disappearance remained officially open. Marsh's report sat in a file. Marsh had moved to another case, a carjacking ring operating out of the Southwest side, a case with different geography and different stakes. She was good at her job. She worked it. Occasionally, in the specific way that certain cases stayed with you, in the margins of other cases, she thought about the woman in the emerald dress who had stepped forward in a ballroom instead of back. She thought about what that had cost. She thought about the word choice and the various things, depending on which side of it you were standing on. She didn't pull any more threads on Caldrisi, not because she'd stopped believing what she believed, because she understood, in the pragmatic way, she understood most things, the difference between what she knew and what she could demonstrate, and in the space between those 2 things, she'd chosen to file it and move on. That was also a choice. She made it without apology. On a Saturday in late April, Zora and Roman attended the opening of a community health center on the south side that Roman's foundation had provided significant funding for, the funding itself being one of the things that existed in the category of legitimate, genuinely, cleanly legitimate, money going toward a building where people who couldn't afford the clinics in the neighborhoods to the north would have access to care. It was not a gala. There was no orchestra, no crystal chandelier, no 400 people in formal wear, constructing careful social architectures. There were folding chairs and a community room and a lot of people who knew each other from the neighborhood and a director who gave a short speech in English and Spanish and a ribbon that was cut with a pair of scissors someone's kid had decorated with marker. Zora talked to people, a woman who'd been bringing her mother to a clinic 45 minutes away by bus, because there was nothing closer. A man who worked 2 jobs and still couldn't make the copay work most months. A girl who was 17 and wanted to be a doctor and was doing her high school independent study project on healthcare access disparities. She talked to the girl for 20 minutes. The girl had opinions. Good ones, specific ones, a kind of opinions that came from someone who'd paying attention and had decided that paying attention obligated you to something. Zora gave her her number. She wasn't sure what she expected from that. Maybe nothing. Maybe something. She left the space open. On the way back to the car, Roman walked beside her and said nothing for a block and then said, "You're going to want to be involved in the organization. I'm already involved. More than you're currently planning." She looked at him. He was looking forward, at the street, at the April light that was finally beginning to feel like what it was supposed to feel like. "Is that an observation or a suggestion?" "An observation," he said. "You talked to 15 people in there. I watched you. You didn't talk to a single person who already had power." Zora thought about that. "Is that a problem?" "No," Roman said. "It's clarifying." She put her hands in her coat pockets and walked beside him. The street was quiet in the particular Saturday afternoon way of residential blocks that hadn't been gentrified. Yet kids on a stoop, a radio from somewhere above, the smell of something cooking in a building they passed. The ordinary gorgeous texture of a neighborhood existing. "I want to run something," she said. Not a question. Not exactly. More like something being said out loud for the first time, in order to see how it sounded. Not just be attached to something. Actually run something. "I know," Roman said. "That's going to complicate things. My visibility. My name being associated with an organization that's going to operate in communities where your name means something complicated. I know that too. It might not be straightforward. Navigating what I am to you and what I'm trying to be separately from that." "No," Roman said. "It won't be straightforward." She walked for a moment. The April light, the radio, the smell of something cooking. "You're not going to tell me it'll be fine," she said. "No," Roman said. "But I'll tell you that you'll figure it out." The navigating. A pause. "You're good at navigating." She thought about the choice between 2 breaths in the living room. She thought about the step forward in the ballroom. She thought about the technically true statements and what they'd cost her and what she'd decided they were worth, and the ongoing process of sitting with that decision. She thought about standing at the coffee counter in the Meridian shops and feeling the ghost and staying anyway. "I'm getting better at it," she said. Roman made a small sound that wasn't quite anything, not agreement, not disagreement, more the sound of a man registering something he found true. They reached the car. He opened the door, and she got in, and he went around to the other side, and the driver pulled out into the April Saturday, and the city moved around them in its ordinary Saturday way, unhurried, proceeding, the business of everyone's lives continuing in all directions at once. She looked out the window. She thought about the girl who wanted to be a doctor, with her opinions and her marker-decorated scissors school project, and the specific quality of her attention that had reminded Zora of something she couldn't immediately name, and then could herself at 17 before she'd learned that her opinions were too much, her body was too much, her presence in rooms was contingent on the willingness of other people to accommodate it. Before she'd learned that, and then after the long after, the ongoing project of the after. She was going to call the girl. She already knew she was going to call the girl. She turned from the window and looked at Roman in the seat beside her. He was looking at his phone, something from the office, the city never releasing him fully from its operational demands, and his face in the car's interior had that quality it had in private, the one that was different from the public face, in ways she'd been cataloging for 9 months now. Slightly less contained. The edges slightly more available. She'd been afraid of him once. Not in the obvious way, not afraid he'd hurt her. Afraid of what she might become, standing next to someone like him. afraid that proximity to that kind of power would change the shape of her, bend her towards something unrecognizable. She didn't think that anymore. She thought, instead, that she'd spent most of her adult life allowing other people's perceptions to construct her Brett's version of her, the shopping center crowd's version, the ballroom's version, Veyron's version. She'd spent a year and a half before Roman trying to build herself back from those versions, and the building had been slow and uncertain, and she'd had no idea, on most days, whether the thing she was building was solid or just impressive looking from certain angles. She thought she knew now, not because Roman was beside her, not because of the penthouse or the security or the particular physics of what it meant to be adjacent to someone who could make Dante Veyron leave a room. Those things had been background useful, sometimes protective, often complicated. But background, the thing that had changed was the step forward. The choice in the living room, the coffee at the Meridian Shop's counter, drunk slowly, standing in the place where it had happened. The girl with the marker-decorated scissors, the file in the cabinet. The thing that had changed was her, changing it. She wasn't going to be thinner. She wasn't going to be quieter. She wasn't going to find a way to occupy space that made other people more comfortable with her presence in it. Brett had spent 7 years trying to teach her that those were the terms, and she had spent 7 years half believing him, and she was done now, not done in the triumphant way that required an audience, just done in the ordinary, durable way of a person who had looked at a lie long enough to recognize it fully. She was 32 years old. She was black and heavyset and tall and visible, and she was learning slowly, in the specific way that learning actually happened, not in revelations but in increments. In the step forward, and the file in the cabinet, and the conversation with the girl, and the coffee at the counter. She was learning what it felt like to take up exactly as much space as she actually occupied. Not more, not less, just the amount. It turned out to be enough. Roman put his phone away. He looked at her. Outside the window, Chicago continued in all its complicated, unglamorous, perpetually in progress beauty. The south side giving way to the bridge and the river, and the downtown towers rising against the April sky. The lakes somewhere to the east, doing what the lake always did, moving, the ice fully gone now, the water dark and restless and completely itself. She didn't say anything. He didn't say anything. The car moved through the city, and the city moved through them, in the way cities moved through people who'd decided to stay not a passive moving, not a backdrop, but something more mutual than that. The city and the person in negotiation, each changing the other in ways neither could fully account for. She reached over and put her hand in his, not because she needed to, because she wanted to. Those were different things, and she knew the difference now, and the knowing was its own kind of arrival. The car turned north onto Lake Shore Drive, and the lake opened up on the right wide, April gray, impossibly large, and Zora looked at it through the window and thought about nothing in particular. Just looked. Just breathed. Just here.